My name is Elliot, and if you had asked me 10 years ago whether I would ever be sitting here, speaking openly about who I am and how I came to understand myself, I would have laughed the kind of laugh that hides a wound. I would have told you I was fine, that I had everything under control, that the small closet at the back of my apartment was just storage. I would have offered you coffee, changed the subject, and gone back to pretending. But pretending has a shelf life. Eventually, the mask you wear becomes heavier than the face beneath it, and one day you wake up and realize you have been carrying a stranger on your shoulders for so long that you have forgotten how to walk without the weight. This is the story of how I put that weight down. It is not a story about spectacle. It is not a story about transformation for the sake of shock. It is a story about a boy who did not know he was allowed to be curious about himself, about a young man who confused shame with morality, about an adult who finally learned that identity is not a costume you steal in the dark, but a truth you slowly learn to greet in daylight. And yes, it is also the story of my Aunt Marla, who left me $4.8 million and a luxury makeup collection worth $40,000, though I want to say plainly at the start that neither the money nor the makeup is what changed me. What changed me was the letter she left underneath them, and the years of quiet witnessing that letter revealed. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where all honest stories start, which is in the confusion of a child who does not yet have the words for what he feels. I grew up in a small town in the middle of a state that mostly gets remembered for its highways. Our house was a narrow two-story with a porch that sagged on the left side, and my father used to joke that the house leaned because it was tired of listening to my mother sing while she cooked. My mother sang constantly, old songs from her own mother, and she wore aprons with little strawberries printed on them, and she had a drawer in the bathroom that smelled like powder and rose water. I remember standing on my toes to look into that drawer when I was maybe 6 years old. I remember the small gold tube of lipstick, the way the cap clicked when you pulled it off, the way the color inside looked like a secret. I did not put it on. I just looked at it. I looked at it the way a child looks at a locked door, wondering what kind of room might be behind it, wondering if the room was for them. I want to be careful here because I know how these stories are often told. They are told as if the child always knew, as if there was a single moment of revelation, as if identity arrives like a package with a return address. That was not my experience. My experience was slower, quieter, and much more confusing. I did not think at 6 that I wanted to be a girl. I did not think at 6 that I wanted to be a boy either. I just thought that some things looked interesting and some things felt warm, and some things made my chest feel like it was full of small birds, and I did not yet know that adults had decided which of those things I was allowed to touch. I learned that lesson quickly, though, the way most children do. My father was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly because it would be easy to tell the story with him as a villain, and he was not a villain. He was a man who had been taught by his own father that boys were a certain shape, and that shape did not bend. When he caught me, at 8 years old, wearing one of my mother's scarves as a cape, he did not yell. He just took the scarf off my shoulders, folded it carefully, and said, "We do not do that, son." That was all. We do not do that. 4 words. But those 4 words became a fence around a large part of my inner life, and for the next 20 years I would build additional fences inside that first one, until I lived in a very small yard indeed. School made the fences taller. I was not bullied in any dramatic way, but I learned to watch other boys the way an anthropologist watches a tribe, taking notes on how they stood, how they laughed, how they held their shoulders when they walked into a room. I copied them. I got good at copying them. By the time I was 12, I could pass for the kind of boy who never thought about scarves at all. But copying is exhausting. Copying is a full-time job. And when I went home and closed the door of my bedroom, I would sometimes sit on the floor with my back against the bed and simply breathe, because breathing was the only thing I did not have to perform. This is where Aunt Marla enters the story, though at the time, I did not understand her importance. Aunt Marla was my mother's older sister. She lived in a city 3 hours away, and she came to visit twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer. She was tall, taller than my father, and she wore her hair in a silver braid that reached the middle of her back. She had never married, which in our town was treated as a kind of mild scandal, and she worked in what she called the beauty industry, which I later learned meant she was a senior executive at a cosmetics company. She smelled like sandalwood, and something citrus underneath. And when she hugged me, she always held on a second longer than my mother did, as if she was checking to see whether I was still in there. I did not understand, as a child, why her visits felt like windows opening in a house that was mostly sealed shut. I only knew that when she was there, I could laugh differently. I could sit differently. Once, when I was 10, she caught me looking at her makeup bag on the kitchen table. She did not react the way my father had reacted to the scarf. She simply opened the bag, took out a small brush, and showed me how the bristles were softer on one side than the other. She said, "This one is for blending, and this one is for definition, and the trick is to know which one you need for which day." She said it as if she were teaching me about tools in a workshop. She said it as if there was nothing strange about a boy wanting to know. Then she zipped the bag closed and said, "When you are older, if you ever want to learn more, you can ask me." I did not ask her, not for many years. But I remembered. I remembered the softness of the brush and the softness of her voice, and I remembered that somewhere in the world there was an adult who did not think curiosity was a crime. My teenage years were the years of hiding. I do not think I need to describe them in great detail, because anyone who has hidden anything from anyone will recognize the shape of them. I dated girls, and I liked some of them, and I was confused because I did not understand that you could like someone and also want to be more like them. I confused desire with envy, and envy with sin, and sin with self, until the whole knot inside my chest was so tangled that I stopped trying to untie it and just carried it around like a stone. I played sports badly. I joined clubs half-heartedly. I got good grades because good grades were a form of camouflage. I told no one anything real. There was one night when I was 16 that I want to mention because it was the closest I came during those years to breaking. My parents were out at a church event, and I was alone in the house, and I walked into their bedroom and stood in front of my mother's closet for what must have been 20 minutes. I did not touch anything. I just looked, and then I closed the closet door and went back to my room and cried in a way I had not cried since I was very small, and I told myself, this is the last time. I told myself I was going to grow up and be normal and be good and never think about this again. I made a promise to a version of myself that did not exist on behalf of a version of myself that I was refusing to meet. I kept that promise for almost a decade. College was easier in some ways because I was away from my father's quiet disappointment and my mother's anxious cheerfulness, but harder in other ways because I had more freedom and did not know what to do with it. I studied economics because it felt safe, because numbers do not ask you who you are. I made friends, kept them at arm's length, and dated a woman named Priya for 2 years. Priya was kind and smart, and she saw more of me than I wanted her to see. She never asked me directly, but sometimes she would look at me across a table, and I would feel the question in her eyes, and I would look away. When we broke up, at the end of senior year, she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Elliot, I do not know who you are, and I do not think you do either, and I hope one day you find out because I think that person is worth knowing." She said it without bitterness. She said it like a blessing. I thanked her, and I cried in my car afterwards, and I still did not do anything about it. After college, I moved to a mid-sized city and took a job at a financial services firm. The job was demanding in the specific way that allows you to disappear into it, and I disappeared gladly. I worked long hours, I made good money, I bought a small apartment, I furnished it with things that had no personality. I told myself I was building a life. What I was actually building was a very expensive hiding place. My 20s passed in a blur of spreadsheets and airport lounges and dinners with colleagues whose names I could barely remember. I saw my parents twice a year. I saw Aunt Marla whenever she was in town, which was more often than I expected, and each time she came she would ask me, in her quiet way, whether I was happy. I always said yes. She always looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she would change the subject. I was 29 when the first crack appeared. It was a Tuesday night, and I had come home from work exhausted, and I was standing in my kitchen eating cereal out of the box, and I caught my reflection in the dark window. I did not recognize the man I saw. I do not mean that in a dramatic way. I mean it literally. I looked at the face in the glass and I thought, who is that? And then I thought more terrifyingly, where am I? I put the cereal down. I sat on the kitchen floor. I stayed there for a long time. I did not cry. I did not do anything. I just sat, and I let the question be in the room with me, the way you might let a stray animal come inside on a cold night. Where am I? Where have I been? Where did I go? That night I did something I had not done since I was 16. I went to a drugstore late, when there was almost no one else in the aisles, and I stood in front of the cosmetics section for a long time. I did not buy anything. I could not make myself. But I stood there and I read the names of the colors, and I let myself want. I let myself want without immediately reaching for the shame that had always followed the wanting. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. It took me 6 more months to buy the first item. It was a tinted lip balm, sold as neutral enough to be marketed to anyone, and I bought it at a self-checkout, so I would not have to look anyone in the eye. I brought it home and I put it in a drawer, and I did not open it for 3 weeks. When I finally did open it, alone in my bathroom at 11 at night, I looked at myself in the mirror with a very small amount of color on my mouth, and I did not feel euphoria, and I did not feel shame, and I did not feel any of the things I had expected to feel. I felt calm. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was in the same room as myself. That calm scared me more than shame would have. Shame I knew how to handle. Shame had a script. Calm did not. Calm was a country I had no map for. So, I did what many people do when they encounter something unfamiliar. I retreated. I put the balm back in the drawer. I told myself it was a phase. I threw myself back into work. I dated, briefly, a woman named Hannah who was witty and impatient, and eventually told me I was emotionally unavailable, which was the most polite way anyone had ever described what I was doing to myself. I agreed with her, and we parted amicably, and I went back to my apartment and stood in front of the drawer again, and I understood that I was not going to be able to keep doing this forever. It was around this time, my early 30s, that Aunt Marla started to get sick. She did not tell us right away. She was that kind of person. She handled things privately, the way she had always handled everything privately, and by the time we found out, the diagnosis was already advanced. I started visiting her more often. Her apartment was on the 12th floor of a building in the city, with tall windows and a view of a river, and it was full of books and art and small strange objects she had collected over decades of traveling. She had a whole wall of framed photographs of women I did not recognize, and when I asked her once who they were, she said, they were my friends, and some of them were more than friends, and some of them I loved very much. She said it without any ceremony. She said it the way you might mention that you had once lived in Paris. I remember I sat very still after she said it, because something in me was rearranging itself, and I did not want to interrupt the rearrangement. She saw my face, I think, because she reached over and put her hand on mine and said, Elliot, honey, I have known you a long time. I have known you longer than you have known yourself. I am not going to ask you anything. I am just going to tell you that whatever you are welcome here. That is all I have ever wanted to tell you. I did not say anything. I could not. I just held her hand and I looked at the wall of photographs, and I thought about all the years she had come to visit us at Christmas and in the summer, and I thought about the makeup brush she had shown me when I was 10, and I understood in a way I had not understood before, that she had been waiting, not pushing, not prying, waiting. She died the following spring. The funeral was small because she had wanted it that way. My mother cried in the way people cry when they have lost a sister and also a piece of their own childhood. My father held my mother's hand, and I stood next to them, and I felt the particular loneliness of grieving someone whose full life you had not fully known. A week after the funeral, I received a call from an attorney. Aunt Marla had left a will. She had, it turned out, been very successful in her career, and she had invested carefully, and she had never spent much on herself in the way people usually spend money on themselves. The estate came to just over $4.8 million, and she had left almost all of it to me. There was also, the attorney said, a personal collection she wanted me to receive directly, and there was a letter. I want to talk about the money for a moment because I know that when people hear a number like that, it becomes the loudest thing in the story, and I do not want it to be the loudest thing. The money was, in a very practical sense, a life-changing gift. It meant I could pay off my mortgage. It meant I could reduce my hours at work. It meant I could, eventually, walk away from the job that had been my hiding place for a decade. But the money was not what shook me. The money was a tool. The money was a door. The thing that shook me was the collection and the letter. The collection arrived a few weeks later in a series of carefully packed boxes that a moving company delivered to my apartment. When I opened them, I found what the attorney had described, though the description had not prepared me for the reality. There were foundations and concealers in nearly every shade a human face could take. There were palettes of eyeshadows organized by season and by mood, some of them from limited editions I had only vaguely heard of. There were lipsticks in small velvet pouches, each one labeled with the year she had bought it and the occasion. There were skincare products in glass bottles that looked more like laboratory equipment than cosmetics. There were brushes, dozens of them, each one wrapped individually. There were perfumes in bottles that were themselves works of art. The appraiser who had done the estate had estimated the collection at around $40,000, and I believe him, but I want to be clear that the monetary value was not the point. The point was that she had built this collection over a lifetime, and she had left it to me. Not to a niece. Not to a friend. To me. And underneath the top layer of the largest box, taped to the inside of the lid, was the letter. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, in the careful looping script I had seen on every birthday card she had ever sent me. I want to share parts of it because I have her permission in a way. She wrote in the letter that whatever I chose to do with her words was up to me, and that she trusted my judgment. So, I will share the parts that mattered most, and I will keep the rest for myself. She began by writing, "Dear Elliot, if you are reading this, then I am no longer able to say these things to you in person, and I am sorry for that, because you deserve to hear them from my own mouth. But I did not know how to say them while I was alive without making you feel watched, and I did not want you to feel watched. I wanted you to feel seen, which is a different thing entirely." She wrote about the first time she had visited our house after I was born, and how she had held me and thought, "This one is going to have a hard time, and I am going to try to make it a little easier." She wrote about the day she had shown me the brush, and how she had gone home that night and cried, because she recognized in me a version of a girl she had once known, and she did not want that girl to spend her whole life waiting. She wrote about my father, whom she described with more generosity than I would have been able to muster, calling him a man who loved deeply but had been given a very narrow language for love, and about my mother, whom she described as a woman who saw more than she said. She wrote about her own life, and this was the part that changed me most. She wrote that she had spent her 20s and 30s trying to become someone she was not, in a different way than I had, but with the same underlying grammar of fear. She wrote that she had lost people she loved because she had not been brave enough to name what she wanted. She wrote that by the time she found the courage to live openly, she was already in her 40s, and although she had built a beautiful life after that, she carried a quiet grief for the years she had spent hiding. She wrote, "I am not going to tell you who you are, Elliot. I do not know who you are. Only you know that, and even you may not know it yet. But I am going to tell you what I have learned, which is that hiding does not protect you. It only postpones you. And the person you postpone the longest is yourself." She wrote that she was leaving me the money not because money buys freedom, but because money buys time, and time is the one thing she wished she could give me more of. She wrote that she was leaving me the collection because she wanted me to know that whatever I chose to do with it, whether I used it or gave it away or kept it in a closet and looked at it only on the hardest nights, it was mine. She wrote, "Do not use it to become someone else. Use it if you use it, to greet someone you have not yet met." She ended the letter with a line I have thought about almost every day since. She wrote, "The bravest thing I ever did was stop apologizing for the shape of my own life. I hope one day you will stop apologizing too. And I hope you will not wait as long as I did." I sat with that letter for a long time. I sat with it in a way I had not sat with anything in years. I did not read it once and put it away. I read it every morning for a month. I read it on the train. I read it in restaurants. I read it in the bathtub, and the paper got soft at the edges, and I did not care. I read it until I had memorized parts of it, and then I read it again to make sure I had memorized the right parts. And slowly, the way ice melts in a warm room, something in me began to shift. I want to talk now about the middle years, the years after the letter, because those were the years of the real work, and I do not want to skip past them the way these stories often skip past them. It is easy to tell a story of transformation as if it happened in a montage. It did not. It happened in appointments and conversations and mistakes and slow decisions. The first thing I did was find a therapist. Her name was Dr. Rowan, and she was in her late 50s, and she had the kind of office that smelled like books and tea. I had never been to therapy before. I had grown up in a house where therapy was something other people did, people who could not handle their own lives, and I had internalized that view, and I had to spend a long time unlearning it before I could even sit down in her chair, without feeling like a failure. But I sat down, and I told her, in the halting way people tell strangers things they have never told anyone, about the scarf and the drawer and the drugstore and the letter and the collection sitting in my spare room in boxes I had not yet fully unpacked. Dr. Rowan did not react the way I had feared she would react. She did not congratulate me.
She did not diagnose me.
She did not hand me a pamphlet. She simply asked me questions, careful questions, questions that pointed toward things I had never been asked before. She asked me what I wanted, not in the abstract, but on any given Tuesday. She asked me what I felt when I put on the tinted lip balm and what I felt when I took it off. She asked me who I was afraid of disappointing and when that fear had started, and whether the people I was afraid of disappointing were even the same people they had been when the fear began. Over the course of many months, with her help, I began to sort through the tangle in my chest. I discovered that I did not have a single, tidy identity waiting to be revealed. I discovered that I had many feelings, some of them contradictory, and that contradiction did not mean I was broken. I discovered that I liked wearing certain clothes that were not conventionally masculine, and that I did not want to give those clothes a label yet, and that not giving them a label was allowed. I discovered that I was, in some ways, a man, and in some ways, something else, and that the something else did not have to resolve into a diagnosis or a category to be real. I discovered that identity, for me, was not a destination but a practice. I began, slowly, to use the collection. I opened one box, then another. I read the labels on the products. I watched tutorial videos late at night made by people much younger than me who spoke about eyeshadow the way my father used to speak about carpentry. I made mistakes. I bought remover in bulk. I laughed at myself, sometimes, in the mirror, and the laughter was not cruel, which was new. I learned that I liked a certain kind of soft rose on my mouth, and that I did not care for heavy eye looks, and that a small amount of blush made me feel like a person who had slept well, even on nights I had not. I did all of this alone in my apartment, with the door locked for almost a year. I was not ready to be seen. I was barely ready to see myself. And then, one Saturday afternoon, I went to a small park near my apartment and I sat on a bench, and I was wearing exactly what I would have worn any other day, which is to say jeans and a plain shirt, except that I had put on a very small amount of the rose color on my mouth. That was all. No one would have noticed unless they were looking closely, and no one was looking closely because people rarely are. But I noticed. I sat on that bench for 2 hours and I read a book, and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, that I was in public as myself. Not fully. Not the way I would later learn to be. But a little more than I had been the day before. And a little more is how these things happen. I want to talk about my parents, because I know that is a question people ask when they hear stories like this. What did your family say? How did they take it? The honest answer is that it took years, and it is still, in some ways, ongoing. I did not sit them down and announce anything. That is not how our family communicates, and it would not have worked. Instead, I began to be a little more honest in small ways over long stretches of time. I mentioned Dr. Rowan. I mentioned that I had reduced my hours at work. I mentioned, eventually, that I had started to explore parts of myself that I had spent a long time ignoring, and I used the word explore deliberately because it was the truest word I had. My mother, to my surprise, was the first to meet me halfway. One afternoon, when I was visiting them, she asked me to help her clean out a closet, and while we were sorting through old boxes, she pulled out a photograph of Aunt Marla from the 1970s, wearing a suit and a tie and looking directly at the camera with an expression I recognized. My mother looked at the photograph for a long time, and then she said, quietly, "I always knew about your aunt. I just did not know how to talk about it. And I did not want to be the reason you thought you could not talk to me." I did not know what to say. I sat on the floor of that closet with my mother, and I cried, and she cried, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "I do not understand everything, Elliot. I want to be honest about that. But I am willing to learn if you are willing to teach me." And I said, I am learning too, so we can learn together. My father took longer. My father takes longer with most things. But he did not shut the door. That is what I want to say about him. He did not shut the door. He asked questions, sometimes clumsily, and I answered them, sometimes clumsily, and we sat in living rooms together and watched football, and did not always talk about the important things, and sometimes we did. One Christmas, several years after Aunt Marla's death, he handed me a small wrapped package, and inside it was a fountain pen, and he said, Marla always used one of these. She said it made her handwriting look like it belonged to someone she wanted to be. I thought maybe you might like one. It was the closest he had ever come to saying he saw me. I have used that pen every day since. Now I want to talk about the money, because I promised myself I would be honest about it, and honesty means not skipping the uncomfortable parts. $4.8 million is a lot of money. It is enough money to change a life, and it is enough money to destroy a life, and I have thought a great deal about which of those two things I wanted it to do. In the first few months after the inheritance, I made a few decisions I am not particularly proud of. I bought things I did not need. I upgraded a car I did not really want. I took a trip that I told myself was for healing but was mostly for distraction. I noticed after a while that the money was becoming another hiding place, in the same way that work had been a hiding place, and that if I was not careful, I would spend the rest of my life converting Aunt Marla's gift into new versions of the same old cage. So I stopped. I sat down with a financial planner, an unglamorous woman named Judith who wore reading glasses on a chain, and I told her I wanted to build a life that did not require me to hide, and I asked her how to do that in a way that would last. She helped me set up a plan. A portion of the money went into long-term, conservative investments. A portion went into a fund I could draw from modestly, which allowed me to reduce my work hours to part-time and eventually to leave that job altogether. A portion went into a charitable trust because I wanted Aunt Marla's money to do the kind of work she would have wanted it to do. I asked Judith to help me research organizations that supported young people who were exploring their identities, particularly in small towns where resources were scarce. I did not want to put my name on anything. I did not want a plaque. I just wanted to know that somewhere, a kid like the one I had been was getting a phone call answered when they needed it. That trust still runs. It is one of the quiet joys of my life. I also began slowly to use some of the money to build a home that reflected who I was, not who I had been pretending to be. I did not buy a mansion. I bought a small house on the edge of a different city, one with a garden and a room with good light where I could set up a proper vanity and where I could keep Aunt Marla's collection on open shelves rather than in boxes. I painted the walls a color she would have liked. I hung one of her photographs in the entryway. Not the most flattering one. The one where she is laughing with her mouth wide open, in a way she had never let a camera catch when she was younger. Living in that house changed something in me. I had spent so many years in spaces that were designed to be neutral, to give away nothing about the person inside them, that I had forgotten a home could be a mirror. My home, now, is a mirror. It reflects a person who is still figuring things out, but who is no longer ashamed of the figuring. I want to talk about the mistakes I made, because a story without mistakes is a story I do not trust. I made many. I trusted the wrong people. At first, with my emerging self. I told, too early, a friend from work whom I had thought of as close, and who responded with a kind of curious cruelty that I had not been prepared for. He did not mock me openly. He just began to treat me differently, in small ways, ways that were deniable, and I spent months trying to convince myself I was imagining it, and then I stopped trying to convince myself, and I stopped inviting him to things, and eventually the friendship faded. That taught me something important, which is that not everyone deserves the deepest parts of your story, and that protecting yourself is not the same as hiding yourself. There is a difference between a locked door and a chosen door. I also, at one point, tried to move too fast. Encouraged by online communities that were sometimes generous and sometimes prescriptive, I convinced myself for a while that I had to arrive at a specific destination, that I had to name myself with a specific word, that I had to make specific medical decisions on a specific timeline. I made an appointment with a specialist and I sat in the waiting room and I realized quite suddenly that I was there because I was trying to prove something to a community rather than because I had listened to myself. I got up. I left. I called Dr. Rowan the next day, and we spent months untangling why I had gone in the first place. What we found was that I had been so eager to belong somewhere after a lifetime of belonging nowhere that I had almost traded one form of performance for another. That was a hard lesson. It is not a lesson against transitioning, which is right for many people and which I hold in the highest respect. It is a lesson against making any decision about your body or your identity to satisfy an audience, even a kind audience. Your identity is not owed to anyone. Not to your family, not to your community, not to a comment section. It is a conversation between you and yourself, and everyone else is at best a witness. Over time, I settled into a version of myself that I now recognize. I present most days, in a way that is quietly feminine, in ways that are visible to those who look but not designed to demand attention. Some days I wear more traditionally masculine clothes and feel entirely at home in them. Some days I wear a dress that Aunt Marla would have loved, and I feel entirely at home in that too. I do not think of these as costumes. I think of them as weather. I dress for the weather of my inner life. I have not chosen a single label to describe myself publicly, because no single label has felt exactly right, and I have come to believe that I do not owe the world a label. The people who love me know how to speak to me. The people who do not love me are not owed my grammar. I want to talk for a moment about mental health because I said at the beginning that this story would touch on it, and I do not want to leave it as an abstraction. There were nights, during the hardest years, when I was not sure I wanted to keep going. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it up, because pretending those nights did not happen would be a betrayal of anyone listening who is having such a night now. I was not, at any point, in a place I could not come back from, but I was, at times, closer to the edge than I let anyone see. What helped me was not a single dramatic intervention. What helped me was small, consistent things. It was Dr. Rowan's office and the smell of her tea. It was a phone number I called once, at 3 a.m, and the woman on the other end who did not try to fix me and just kept me on the line until the sun came up. It was a friend I made later, a woman named Iris who had walked a similar road and who checked in on me every Sunday for 2 years without ever making it feel like an obligation. It was, and this is not sentimental, it is true, the letter from Aunt Marla, which I kept on my nightstand and read on the worst nights, and which reminded me that someone had seen me before I had seen myself, and that being seen is a form of being kept alive. If you are listening and you are in one of those nights, I want to say 2 things. The first is that you are not alone, even when the room feels empty. The second is that reaching out is not weakness. It is the most adult thing a person can do. Please call someone. A hotline, a friend, a family member, a doctor. The version of you that will exist a year from now is worth the phone call. I know because I am that version for someone. I want to talk about the responsibility that came with all of this because I think it is the least discussed part of stories like mine. When you inherit money, and when you inherit a legacy from someone who loved you, and when you finally begin to live as yourself, there is a temptation to think you have arrived. You have not. You have simply been given more tools. What you do with those tools is a daily choice. I have tried, imperfectly, to make choices that honor what Aunt Marla gave me. I have tried to be honest with the people in my life, even when honesty is uncomfortable. I have tried to be generous without being performative. I have tried to be patient with my parents, who did not have the models I have had, and who are doing their best. I have tried, especially, to be careful with younger people who reach out to me now, sometimes through the small blog I keep, sometimes through mutual friends, sometimes through the organizations Aunt Marla's Trust supports. When a 19-year-old writes to me and asks whether they should come out to their family, I do not tell them what to do. I ask them what they need. I ask them whether they are safe. I ask them who their Aunt Marla is, and if they do not have one, I ask them whether I can be a small version of one from a distance for a little while until they find someone closer. I say all of this not to congratulate myself. I say it because I want to make clear that identity work is not only about what you become. It is also about what you become responsible for. The freedom I have found is not a private freedom. It is a freedom I owe forward to the people who are still where I used to be. That, more than anything, is what Aunt Marla taught me. She did not leave me $4.8 million and a $40,000 makeup collection because she wanted me to be rich or beautiful. She left them because she wanted me to have what she had not had, and she wanted me, in turn, to pass some of it on. The money is a tool. The makeup is a tool. The letter was the real inheritance, and the letter, in the end, was an instruction. It said, do better than I did and do it sooner, and when you have done it, help someone else. I am, at the time of this telling, in my early 40s. I live in a house that feels like mine. I have a partner, whose name I will not share here, because their story is theirs to tell, and I have learned that not every detail of a life needs to be public to be real. I have a small circle of friends who have known me long enough to have seen several versions of me, and who love the current one without needing it to be the final one. I have my parents, who visit twice a year now, the way Aunt Marla used to visit us, and who have learned to compliment me on my earrings without making it a whole event. I have my work, which is now part-time consulting and part-time volunteering with the organizations the Trust supports. I have my mornings, which start with tea and a few minutes at the vanity that once belonged to Aunt Marla, where I use one of her brushes to put a small amount of color on my face, and I think of her, and I think of the little boy who stood on his toes to look into his mother's drawer, and I think of the 16-year-old who cried in front of a closet, and I tell all of them, quietly, that we made it. We made it here. We are okay. There are still hard days. I want to say that too because I do not want to leave you with the impression that identity work ends. It does not end. There are days when I catch a stranger's glance and feel the old fence rise up around me, and I have to remind myself, gently, that I am not 8 years old, and no one is going to take my scarf. There are days when I miss Aunt Marla so much that I cannot open the vanity, and I go for a walk instead, and I let the missing be what it is. There are days when I read something online that tells me I am doing my identity wrong, that I should have chosen a clearer path, that my ambiguity is a form of cowardice, and I have to sit with that and remind myself that my life is not a debate to be won. There are days when I feel deeply, quietly happy in a way that surprises me, and on those days I try to remember to send a message to someone else. Someone who might be having a harder day, because happiness that is not shared eventually turns stale. If there is a single thing I want to leave you with, it is this. Identity is not a discovery. It is a relationship. It is not something you find under a rock and hold up to the light. It is something you build, day by day, with yourself, in the quiet hours when no one is watching. It is the willingness to ask on a Tuesday night in your kitchen, who is that in the window, and to sit on the floor with the question rather than run from it. It is the courage to open the drawer and the humility to close it again when you are not ready. It is the patience to unpack a box slowly, over years, rather than tear through it in a night. It is the grace to let the people who love you catch up to you, and the honesty to let go of the ones who will not. It is, above all, the recognition that you are allowed. You are allowed to be curious about yourself. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to be more than one thing. You are allowed to take your time. And you are allowed, when you have finally begun to know yourself, to help someone else begin. I did not tell this story to shock you. I did not tell it to impress you. I did not tell it because a woman in my family left me a large amount of money and an unusual gift, though those are the details that will probably stay in your memory the longest, and that is all right. I told this story because somewhere tonight, there is a child looking into a drawer they have been told not to look into, and there is a teenager standing in front of a closet they have been told not to open, and there is an adult sitting on a kitchen floor asking a question they have been told not to ask. And I wanted them to know that the question is allowed. The looking is allowed. The wondering is allowed. And on the other side of the wondering, if they are patient with themselves and kind to themselves, and lucky enough to have even one person in their life who says quietly, whatever you are welcome here, there is a life waiting for them. Not a perfect life. Not a spectacular life. A real one. A quiet one. A morning at a vanity, and a pen from a father who is learning, and a photograph of an aunt laughing with her mouth wide open, and a house painted a color someone would have liked, and a small rose color on a mouth that has finally stopped apologizing. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.